Thank you. We now will move on to the next item of business, which is, of course, a follow-on business. Firstly, before we do so, and before we move to the debate on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at stage 3, I will call on Gillian Martin to signify Crown consent to the bill. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For the purposes of Rule 911 Standing Orders, advise the Parliament that His Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill, has consented to place his prerogative and interest insofar as they are affected by the bill and at the disposal of the Parliament for the purposes of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20549 in the name of Gillian Martin on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons. And I call on Cabinet Secretary Gillian Martin to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I open the debate today, I want to start by thanking members from across the Chamber and the Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands Committee for the positive spirit in which they have engaged over many weeks with me and my government colleagues during stage 1 and stage 2, and I firmly believe that their detailed scrutiny, feedback and thoughtful challenge have shaped this bill for the better, from the inclusion of measures to help specific species like the swift to those seeking protect our internationally important wetlands. And I also want to thank all the stakeholders who gave evidence as well. Mary Goujon, Jim Fairley and I have spent much of the last few weeks meeting with members, listening, discussing concerns and working through proposals. And indeed that engagement has led to many of the positive amendments that we've passed yesterday afternoon and the previous afternoon to protect Scotland's nature. And a timely reminder that constructive dialogue leads to better and more effective law. And I also want to again thank our diverse stakeholders, including the environmental organisations, land managers, crofters, farmers, fishers, gamekeepers, community trusts, public bodies such as Nature Scot and SEPA for their input and expertise, which has been absolutely invaluable to all of us. Presiding Officer, today offers the opportunity for all of us to send a very clear and strong message that this Parliament stands on the side of nature, and I would encourage all members to take that opportunity. And I appreciate that members may disagree on some of the mechanisms or pace of delivery, but I don't think anyone disputes the urgency of the challenge in front of us or the responsibility that we all share. That shared understanding has been evident not just for the broad support of the bill's aims, but in the number and breadth of amendments that have been brought forward. Together, they reflect a collective determination to ensure that this legislation is as ambitious as possible and genuinely responsive to the realities facing our natural environment. That willingness to test, strengthen and stretch the bill demonstrates a Parliament that is determined to set a stronger, more far-reaching framework for environmental stewardship. And it's a framework rooted not only in protecting what we have left, but crucially in restoring what we have lost. Scotland's ambition must not simply be to conserve our natural environment, but to lead globally in repairing it, restoring habitats, rebuilding resilience and renewing the ecosystem that sustains us. I also want to turn to address directly the removal of Part 2 of the bill, which contained powers to amend elements of the environmental impact assessment legislation and the habitats regulations. And I understand the depth of feeling that was expressed at stage 1 and stage 2 on this issue. Many stakeholders and members were clear that they did indeed want stronger safeguards, particularly around non-regression and concerns that future governments might weaken standards. Those concerns were sincerely held and they were heard. And I hope that the removal of the Part 2 strengthens confidence in the bill as a whole. However, I must be clear that as a result of the removal of Part 2, we do still face a legislative gap created by Brexit. In the short term, we can use the powers under the Continuity Act, but looking further ahead, we need to consider a long-term solution. So we'll take time now to carefully consider options, and I will continue to engage with stakeholders and members. But I strongly believe that any future proposals must reflect our commitment to maintaining high environmental standards and also be more than a temporary solution to fix that gap. Presiding Officer, the bill demonstrates the Scottish Government's and this Parliament's firm and shared commitment to protecting and restoring Scotland's world-class natural environment. And if passed today, which I do hope we will overwhelmingly, the next phase will be to bring forward statutory targets to give full effect to the framework of the bill establishes. These targets will be developed through engagement with the Parliament and stakeholders and will provide clear direction, accountability and ambition for nature recovery. We are now entering the final phase of the four-step process to develop recommendations for statutory targets, working in close collaboration with the independent experts of the Programme Advisory Group. We look forward to bringing forward those recommendations and to continue constructive engagement with stakeholders as we consider the careful development and refinement of the targets. But today, Presiding Officer, our focus is on the amended bill before us, a bill that creates the strongest statutory framework Scotland has ever had for nature recovery, a bill that is strengthened by cross-party work, a bill that reflects a shared commitment to protect and restore our precious natural environment. The crisis we face is urgent, but it is not hopeless. We know that biodiversity is in crisis, both globally and at home, but with clarity, collaboration, long-term determination, Scotland can chart a different course, one where restored habitats, healthier ecosystems and thriving species are not exceptional but expected. This Parliament has an opportunity today to lay the foundations for that future, to send a clear signal across Scotland and beyond that we can intend to leave our natural environment in better condition than we found it, and to ensure that future generations do not inherit the consequences of inaction, but the legacy of commitment and hope. I move the motion in my name. I look forward to listening to members contribute to the debate this afternoon, and I move that the Parliament agrees that the Natural Environment Scotland Bill be passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Tim Eagle to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Mr Eagle is joining us remotely. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I just start by reminding members of my register of interests. At stage 3 of the Natural Environment Bill, it is right that we step back and ask not only what this legislation seeks to do, but whether it will genuinely deliver better outcomes for nature, communities and those who manage our land. There are parts of the bill where there was once genuine consensus. The removal of Part 2 on protected areas was a clear example of that. That section was taken out because members across parties recognised that it was not ready, not workable and not supported by those expected to deliver it. Scotland is not new to biodiversity plans. We have had strategies, frameworks and action plans stretching back decades. They have often been well-intentioned and carefully drafted, yet too many have failed to halt decline. That failure has not been because of a lack of targets on paper, but because of inconsistent political will, fragmented delivery and in recent years changes to budgets. Against that backdrop, the Scottish Conservatives do not believe that statutory targets, however well-meaning, will succeed where previous approaches have struggled. Targets alone do not restore habitats, support species or rebuild trust. Practical, cooperative action on the ground does that. That is why cooperative deer management matters so much. For years, voluntary deer management groups have worked across boundaries, balancing environmental outcomes with animal welfare and needs of rural economies. Deer management is not just an environmental issue, it underpins jobs, sporting activity, tourism and fragile local supply chains. Changes proposed in this bill, when taken alongside the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Bill and the Agricultural Bill, have contributed to a growing sense within the rural sector that decisions are being done to them rather than with them. A government moving to make big changes in an area that needs time. I'm happy to take the intervention from Jim Fairley.
Minister.
I'd thank Tim Eagle very much for taking the intervention. So he talks about the fact that rural deer managers have managed deers effectively over a number of years, and yet we have a crisis in the number of deer that we have, damaging environment, and everybody in this chamber in this debate has agreed that we need to bring those deer numbers down. So that's the first point. The second point is, he talks about the agricultural community and the support that we are giving to the agricultural space. We are the only part of the UK that continues direct support, that continues SUS, that continues ELFAS. Those are things that are warmly welcomed by the agricultural community. So where does the member get the idea that this isn't a government that's working for the people of Scotland?
Tim Eagle.
Oh, Minister, I could spend the next hour telling you why you're not a government supporting the people of Scotland, but I don't go into that. But I mean, the Rural Support Plan, Minister, I mean, when you bring that to me and give me details, then perhaps we can have a further discussion. But the point on deer, I think, is slightly more valid. If I am right in saying this, and I'm happy for the organisations like SLE and BACS to come in, the deer management sector were ready to work proactively with you without needing a lot of the stuff in this bill. If there was more deer needed to be killed, then we could have done that, I think, in a different way. I cannot overstate, Minister, I think, how damaging that I feel the erosion of trust has been. Land managers, farmers and estates feel increasingly, I believe, that the traditional rural economy is under threat, not supported as a partner in environmental delivery. That is not a healthy place to be if we genuinely want to improve biodiversity outcomes. My advice to the government, I feel I have been saying my whole career, is stop focusing on telling landowners, farmers and crofters to complete ever-complex paperwork and start having a positive relationship with them on the ground. This bill also touches on national parks, and here there has been, for me, a glaring missed opportunity, which both Fergus Ewing and I both picked up on during the amendment stage. Before embarking on discussions about new national parks, no formal comprehensive review was carried out of how existing parks have performed, what has worked well and what has not, and crucially, how local communities view that experience. That review could have been the golden ticket. It could have strengthened public confidence, addressed long-standing concerns, and created a model for parks that genuinely thrive economically, socially and environmentally. By skipping that step, we have missed the chance to learn lessons and to bring communities with us. The breadth of this bill is also striking, I imagine, to everyone. There is so much that could have been included, such as mechanisms to protect our natural environment against wildfires, a critical issue I am personally deeply worried about. I am sympathetic to members across the Chamber who have sought to use this legislation to address other long-standing gaps where the Scottish Government has yet to act. That in itself speaks to a wider frustration about delivery and follow-through. Let me be clear, rural Scotland does have a vital role in protecting and enhancing our natural environment, and in truth, much of the rural sector has been doing that exactly for years. What is needed now are practical, locally flexible schemes that recognise the differences between our rural communities, not abstract, paper-based targets that risk hampering rather than heralding a new chapter. Get this right and rural Scotland will thrive, deliver for nature and the economy together. Get it wrong and there is a real risk of destabilising the very communities we rely on to manage our land and which are vital in protecting our food security. Having considered all of this, the Scottish Conservatives do not believe that statutory targets will achieve what voluntary cooperative approaches have struggled to do. We do not believe the case for national parks has been properly made. It clearly required review. And the proposed changes to deer management still do not sit comfortably or ensure a real living cooperative approach moving forward. And for those reasons, the Scottish Conservative Group have decided not to support this bill at stage 3. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now call on Sarah Boyack to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I first of all apologise to the Cabinet Secretary and to colleagues for not being here at the start of this debate. I missed the entire speech. I will look it up online in the official report afterwards. I was chairing a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association branch exec meeting, so I just did want to record that apology. This is an amazing process we've all been through as we reach the end of stage 3 of the Natural Environment Bill. It has generated an enormous level of engagement. And I think the work of the committee, the clerks, the staff, the support we have in Parliament has been huge because, you know, having late-night sittings is not something we normally do. So the effort to get us to this point has been huge. I think from our perspective, the many amendments that were debated at stage 2 after the detailed scrutiny of our committee colleagues and even at stage 3, I think, huge numbers of amendments. The volume and quality of contributions from stakeholders, experts and communities has been remarkable. And that engagement has certainly shaped our approach throughout. And I hope collectively it strengthened the bill. And it underlines how vital this legislation is. While the future of our biodiversity is uncertain in the age of the twin climate and nature emergencies, strong legislation and clear guidance are absolutely critical if we're going to secure a more sustainable future. And Scottish Labour has been consistent in our core aim to improve this legislation where possible, to make it more ambitious, more accountable and more capable of delivering the nature recovery that Scotland urgently needs. That's why we brought forward a series of amendments at each part of the bill, not to obstruct it, but to enhance and strengthen it, and sometimes to get issues on the record officially. These included proposals and detailed evidence from Scottish Environment Link, who've done a superb work pulling stakeholders together, Marine Conservation Society, the Sustainable Inshore Fisheries Trust and the Scottish Creel Fishermen's Federation. A huge amount of work being done, and organisations like the Woodlands Trust, RSPB, and I can't list all the organisations which you normally can, but I think the engagement process to strengthen transparency, improve reporting, ensure that commitments are backed by clear mechanisms for delivery. These are important. And I do want to welcome the fact that some of the proposals we proposed were accepted and got cross-party support. And indeed, drafting was assisted by colleagues. And it does show that constructive engagement can lead to better lawmaking. But not all of our amendments were successful, and we are disappointed about that. But as I say, we've got lots of issues on the record, and I hope that new ministers in the next session will provide the new leadership and action that is going to be urgently needed right across these issues. So we will not stop in terms of our commitment today. We continue to work with all those stakeholders, environmental organisations, and those business organisations and community groups to ensure that the issues they raise do not fall away simply because the bill is passed. Because lots of these decisions were debates about how different pieces of the legislation would impact different communities. And I think going forward, monitoring and reporting on this bill is going to be critical. Delivery is going to be what matters. I've thanked the committee for its consideration and their clerks because, honestly, it was a huge amount of work. The pre-stage 1 work, working all the way through stage 2, and then the level of engagement at stage 3, that has been absolutely critical. And hearing from people directly, from those working on the ground, in our landscapes, our rivers, our lochs and our seas, that has been vital. I want to reflect briefly on the marine sector in particular, because throughout this process, the passion, the expertise and the urgency of those expressed who work in our marine and fishing environment has stood out to me. So we need to do more to make sure that our seas are restored and resilient. And I want to focus on this issue because we heard repeatedly that the Scottish Government will continue to work through all options, but I'd like more clarity on what that means in practice. We heard concerns that the UK Marine Strategy only requires Scotland to contribute to UK-wide reporting and progress towards good environmental status in regional sea areas. It doesn't require the Scottish Government to show that progress, how it works for Scotland, and it doesn't give Scottish Parliament scrutiny for Scotland-specific progress. So I think it's vital that the next session of Parliament looks at this issue, because we can't just rely on the UK Marine Strategy. We've got devolved powers that can and should be used to set out how we'll meet nature restoration targets in our own waters. So I did mention I was grateful to the Cabinet Secretaries for engaging constructively in these points, but I really think work needs to continue. The sector is ready to contribute to the solutions we need. And I do know that some work is underway. I welcome that assurance. But delivery, transparency and accountability will determine whether this bill succeeds in practice. So, the values underpinning this bill, collaboration, ambition, a willingness to listen, must continue long after today's vote. Because nature recovery is not a short-term tick the box. It's a long-term issue. It impacts on all of us, our health and well-being and future generations. So we need sustained political support right across the chamber. Presiding officer, I'll finish on the point that we will support efforts to strengthen our natural environment, and will keep pushing for the action, the ambition and accountability Scotland's biodiversity crisis demands. That is why we will support this bill today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call in Mark Ruskell to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The purpose of this bill is, of course, to tackle the nature emergency, and we should be in no doubt that Scotland is, sadly, a nature-depleted country. But those green shoots of recovery are everywhere, from beaver-built wetlands to urban meadows teeming with pollinators and people. And I want to pay tribute to the communities, the conservationists and land managers who have made so much progress over the years, and I hope this bill will really turbocharge their efforts going forward. Before returning to Holyrood, I sat on the Scottish Biodiversity Forum as COSLA's representative. And what I saw at the time, over a decade ago, was inertia and inaction. There were no targets, there were no action plans. So I'm proud that in this session of Parliament that my colleague Lorna Slater as Minister rebooted the biodiversity strategy and set the wheels in motion for this bill. And it's right that the international commitments that she signed us up to at the Biodiversity Conference of Parties are now enshrined in this bill, and I'm delighted that her amendment passed into the bill to achieve that. Now, we will be agreeing tonight the requirement for action-focused targets to get on to a faster track to restoring nature. And that will need a degree of flexibility in how sites are designated going forward if we're to realise a much bolder ambition of landscape-scale restoration. But a case for wholesale reform of regulations at the backbone of nature protection was not made by government or stakeholders. And I think it is right that the ministerial powers in Part 2 of the bill to amend these laws were removed. We have seen at Westminster the threat to the environment from the watering down of nature law. That mustn't happen here now or in the future. But if there is a case for more precise surgery of the habitats and environmental assessment regulations, then it will be for a future government to bring those proposals back to this chamber. In the meantime, commitments given by the Cabinet Secretary to update guidance are welcome, and I think will provide that clarity that's needed to get on with the job of nature restoration at scale. Now, it's clear that we can't deliver a full-scale restoration of our woodlands and peatlands without properly managing deer to finally bring numbers permanently down. And we now have, of course, reforms in Part 4 of this bill that give Nature Scot and land managers the best chance of delivering the action needed to get to sustainable deer numbers at last. There is still more work to be done, though, to roll out the recommendations of the Independent Deer Working Group, and I think we've got to continue to work hard to realise the legacy of Simon Pepper and his group. They did incredible work back in 2017. There is still work to be done on this, Minister. Part 1 and Part 4 of this bill, I hope, will in time prove transformational. Part 2 is thankfully gone. But Part 3 on national parks, for me, I feel represents unfinished business. It does feel like this government wants to keep the lid on national parks at a time when I think we need them more than ever to deliver the right opportunities for people and nature, but in some of the most sensitive landscapes that we have in Scotland. I will do, yes, briefly.
Sarah Boyd.
I'm proud to have delivered our national parks, and I think one of the key things we need to do is we need to learn the lessons of what good has been done in our national parks and what more needs to be done, and that we do need more national parks in Scotland as well, and there are going to be big lessons to learn from this Parliament. Would the member agree?
Mark Ruskell.
Well, I think the big lessons are that what we need is political leadership. And I'm not just talking about whoever is the minister at the time. I think it's leadership on the ground. I think it's people who want to back national parks in their communities, actually sticking their heads above the parapet and saying this is going to be good for our communities. I live in a national park. I can see what the advantages are every day. There was clearly an appetite from communities across Scotland for more parks. There was a quiet confidence there that we were going to get more parks. That's not going to go away, despite the NFUS and their campaigning. It's not going to go away, and I think all politicians need to recognise that. Presiding Officer, in closing, I will turn to some of the amendments that have strengthened this bill, but right now I will say that the Scottish Greens are very happy to vote for this bill at stage 3.
Thank you, Mr Ruskell. And I call Beatrice Wishart to open on behalf of Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak this evening for the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Through the process of this bill, it has been encouraging to see the evident passion and care for the environment among members in this Parliament. I place on record my thanks to the convener, members and clerks of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee and the legislation team. Thanks too to the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Islands, Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity and Scottish Government officials for their constructive engagement with me, and all the stakeholders who gave evidence at stage 1, sent briefings and met with me to discuss the bill and share their expertise. Particular thanks to Scottish Environment Link, the RSPB and Scottish Land and Estates for working with me on amendments. Scottish Liberal Democrats recognise that the climate crisis and biodiversity loss are not separate issues but deeply intertwined. Scotland's on the front line of biodiversity loss, with 1 in 9 species at risk of national extinction. Scotland ranks 212th out of 240 countries for biodiversity intactness. Part 1 of the bill enables the Scottish ministers to set targets for improving biodiversity. Targets have the potential to focus efforts to address the biodiversity crisis. I was pleased that my Stage 3 amendment passed, which explicitly links the new statutory targets to the existing biodiversity duty. Scotland's public bodies and office holders will have to take the biodiversity targets into account when fulfilling their public sector biodiversity duty. This will align the whole public sector behind the implementation of the targets, removing the risk of a top-down approach and improving consistency of approach to biodiversity ambitions across the public sector. Invasive non-native species, or INS, are a key driver of biodiversity loss in Scotland. Though in the end I didn't move my amendment, which would have given legal underpinning to the forthcoming National INS Action Plan, the debates we've had on this have underscored the need for action, and I note the Cabinet Secretary has put on record the Scottish Government's commitment to doing so. I look forward to the outcomes of the Environmental Standards Scotland INS investigation, and I trust that the recommendations resulting from this work will feed into the INS plan in collaboration with stakeholders. And although I won't be here at that time, I will be watching. Several marine issues were raised in the amendment debates. While targets under this bill could be created for both terrestrial and marine environments, it was not the appropriate vehicle for other marine matters which require appropriate evidence bases, consultation and co-design with stakeholders. Proposed marine amendments also cut across existing and ongoing work, including the Inshore Fisheries Management Improvement Programme and the new National Marine Plan, where nature recovery will be a key objective alongside addressing climate change and supporting a sustainable marine economy. However, I hope that the Scottish Government takes note of the strength of the frustration expressed at the length of time these are taking and concerns about the resourcing of the Marine Directorate, my own comments on which are well documented. At Stage 2, the former Part 2 of the bill was removed by the committee due to concerns that the provisions could potentially weaken nature protections in Scotland, and I appreciate that the Scottish Government has listened to these concerns and not attempted to reinsert these provisions. Turning now to Part 4 of the bill, which modernises the 1996 Deer Act, as I underscored at Stage 1, it's important that the changes do not impact the trust in the sector that underpins voluntary deer management, which is vital for controlling deer numbers in Scotland. Consultation and co-design with the stakeholders is vital to ensure getting the code of practice right. I was pleased to put forward amendments which ensure that local communities and neighbouring land managers were properly considered when deer control schemes are proposed, giving them greater involvement in processes that may affect them. I'm also pleased that my amendments to the Muirburn licensing scheme created by the Wildlife Management and Muirburn Act were supported. The changes enable high-quality Muirburn training to take place under licence and improve regulatory clarity for the making of Muirburn on peatland, while still retaining strong environment oversight. At Stage 1, I stated that we had an opportunity for action on the environment, and by passing this bill tonight, we take an important step to realise that opportunity. Scottish Liberal Democrats will support the bill today.
Thank you, Ms Wishart. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Finlay Carson. Dr Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The United States 26th President, Theodore Roosevelt, noted, "Conservation means development as much as it does protection. I recognise the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognise the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us." The Natural Environment Bill we have before us today is just such an effort, I believe, and seeks to ensure that the people of Scotland do not waste or rob our natural world for future generations. The twin crises of climate change and nature loss are interdependent risks and need to be tackled together, which this bill seeks to do. The bill establishes the framework for targets, including high-level topics against which specific targets will be set, while the actual targets, such as the detail of the quantitative figures, will be provided in secondary legislation. This approach allows for targets to be adapted in the light of circumstances and ensures that parliamentary scrutiny is maintained throughout. The bill also brings together other measures that will enable us to restore and protect nature and support delivery of the Scottish Government's net zero and biodiversity goals. These measures include provisions to modernise the aims and powers of national parks by amending the National Parks Scotland Act 2000, and the bill also reforms the way in which deer are managed by amending the Deer Scotland Act 1996 through the implementation of many of the recommendations made by the Deer Working Group. Today, across much of rural Scotland, the need for effective deer management, as other members have said, is urgent and is something that is regularly raised with me by my constituents. I am pleased to have been able to successfully table an amendment at stage 2 which builds on existing legislation widening the legal right for occupiers of land to cull deer to prevent damage to unimproved land as well as improved land. Now, while I appreciate that some estates have raised concerns in relation to this part of the bill, I do believe that the Government's amendments at stage 3 on notification requirements, as well as the guidance which will be set out in secondary legislation, provides reassurance on animal welfare, food safety and income from deer stalking. This proposal was initially recommended and supported by the Deer Working Group, which was established by the Scottish Government in 2017 as a result of the Government's concern at the continuing issues over the standards of deer management in Scotland and the levels of damage to public interest caused by deer. Presiding Officer, it is clearly essential that stakeholders continue to work together in the ways they have already been doing to help reduce deer numbers and to support biodiversity recovery across Scotland. Improving our biodiversity is one of the best chances that we have to adapt to climate change, to prevent climate change and to ensure that we can continue to enjoy nature's benefits on which we all depend. This has, as other members have pointed out, been a very long but I think successful process, a parliamentary process, a very long engagement with the public, and I would, like other members, convey my thanks to the committee members and to their staff in the doing of that. But to conclude, as someone who represents an island constituency, I believe that the provisions set out in the bill before us today are necessary to support our communities in responding to our biodiversity crisis, and so the bill deserves our support this evening.
Thank you. And I call Finlay Carson to be followed by Mercedes Vialba.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My remarks this evening will not focus on any one provision of the bill, but on its underlying principles. As my colleague Tim Eagle has set out, me and my colleagues will not be supporting the bill at decision time, and I want to be equally clear about why. It's not because we lack ambition for Scotland's natural environment, far from it. It's because this bill takes the wrong approach, one that risks replacing delivery with paperwork, collaboration with uncertainty and practical restoration with legal process. Scotland's nature needs more than aspiration. We have aspiration in bucketfuls across our rural communities. What we need is workable policies grounded in evidence, shaped in partnership with the people who deliver it on the ground, and policy which is accountable to this Parliament through clear reporting, not courtroom targets. This has attracted little comment during stage 3, but the most controversial element has been the removal of the broad enabling powers over environmental assessments that sat in part 2 of the bill. At stage 2, the committee was right to insist that such sweeping, undefined powers should not sit on the statute book without full consultation or clarity. Sadly, as we see far too often, SNP members blindly supported the government's position, choosing not to heed the views of every single witness and stakeholder outside the government who were deeply concerned about that part of the bill. Presiding Officer, restoration does not start with targets, it starts with policy, it starts with funding, with practical projects, with guidance from practitioners and guidance that those practitioners can use. Targets may sound decisive, but they rarely plant a tree, restore a peatland or bring a habitat back to life. Too often they produce a one-size-fits-all timetable, defensive compliance exercises and a drift toward litigation that displaces genuine collaboration. If ministers want accountability, there is a simpler and better route. Bring forward time-bound delivery plans, costed and linked to budget, with milestones before this Parliament. Let MSPs scrutinise progress openly and let practitioners shape the detail through guidance that is responsive rather than rigid. Use primary legislation where there is a specific regulatory gap, not as a catch-all vehicle for unresolved policy questions. And that brings me to the wider way this bill approaches change. Practitioners, whether farmers, land managers, conservation organisations, fishers, foresters or volunteers, are not obstacles to environmental recovery. They are the people who make it happen. Legislation that affects them must be designed with them. That means publishing criteria, thresholds, definition and evidence in advance of commencement, tailoring policy to local circumstances rather than imposing universal figures that ignore geography, habitat type or community context. That's never been more true than in deer management. And treating trust as something to be earned and maintained through transparency, dialogue-first processes and proportionate enforcement. Nowhere is that more important than the provisions that impact the rural livelihoods. What is missing from so much of this SNP government's approach and their attraction to framework bills, whether this bill or the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act or the Good Food Nation Act, is clarity and direction. We need transition that keeps supply chains running rather than placing sudden barriers in front of them. We need clarity about fees, timelines and support long before new duties begin. Good environmental legislation, and indeed any legislation, is not just about ambition, it's also about pragmatism and the capacity to deliver. If we lose belief or lose sight of outcomes, we lose buy-in from our biggest businesses. And if volunteers, small holdings, community groups and micro-businesses find the rules too confusing, too costly or too sudden, we will have weakened, not strengthened, our ability to restore nature. Presiding Officer, I also want to address the scope and conduct of Stage 2 and Stage 3. This bill is much broader than the one that entered the Parliament. It may be a bit hypocritical in terms of Stage 3 amendments, because I brought one myself, but the lack of meaningful progress is in so many areas of rural policy inevitably leads to members to try and find other ways to address shortcomings in this government. Those shortcomings have meant entirely new topics have appeared: marine matters, forestry matters, enforcement frameworks, funding mechanisms. Some have merit, but many lack adequate consultation or evidence. Substantive new policies, particularly in sectors as technical as marine management or forestry, should be brought forward through focused standalone legislation with proper scrutiny and impact assessments. Late additions at Stage 3 are not the way to make good law and risk creating confusion that will fall on regulators and practitioners alike. They also reveal a lack of pace and leadership from this government in sectors where action is overdue, sustainable fisheries being one of them. We need more urgent focus if we are to protect coastal communities and our fishing industry while creating a healthier marine environment. If this bill passes this evening, the process for setting headline targets must ensure robust, fit-for-purpose co-design with practitioners, with outcomes published well before commencement. Presiding Officers, we cannot support a bill that does little to deliver nature restoration in practice, but creates uncertainty and risks eroding trust. Scotland deserves better lawmaking than that. We will vote against it tonight, but we stand ready to work constructively on tighter, clearer, better scope legislation and on the practical programmes that restore nature, project by project, place by place.
Thank you. And I now call Mercedes Vialba, the final speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Throughout the passage of this bill, I've consistently made the case that it should not simply seek to prevent further degradation of the natural environment, but that it should seek to restore and regenerate it, because repeatedly governments have failed to meet their environmental targets, failing us and failing our shared moral obligation to the world. We've seen centuries of habitat destruction due to overexploitation, the release of invasive non-native species and pollution, meaning Scotland is now one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Our peatlands, which are vital in sequestering carbon, are damaged. The Caledonian forest, once covering around 1.5 million hectares, is now reduced to just 1 to 3% of its original size. And a number of our iconic native species, such as the red squirrel, have been driven to near extinction. So while this bill does represent a positive step forward, it alone will not be enough to outpace the rate at which biodiversity is declining. Our Parliament and our governments must go further and faster than ever before. And while I am delighted to see strong steps forward in this bill, I am disappointed that areas of amendment that I'd understood the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action would work with me on did not come to fruition. But even though we weren't able to make headway in this bill on a polluter pays principle, on ecological connectivity, on the invasive non-native species action plan, or on exemptions under the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, progress has been made. We've worked constructively to pass an amendment to ensure the vital role of ESS currently plays in upholding environmental law remains independent from government and business, and I do welcome that. But it's not enough. A polluter pays principle would put the ethical and financial responsibility onto the developers and private companies who are causing harm to the environment. In this, it would relieve the pressure on Nature Scott, who use their stretched budget to mitigate against the damage caused by private companies. I'm pleased that more progress has been made on forestry, and I thank Ms Goujon for working on Amendment 40 with me. Passing this and giving the UK forestry standard a statutory footing is a huge step in the right direction. It outlines responsible forestry standards to help forests become resilient to environmental degradation. However, simply creating this power is not enough, and it's incumbent on this Parliament to ensure that the next Scottish Government uses it. I'm deeply disappointed we don't have further protections relating to invasive non-native species, particularly with regards to Sitka spruce, because the issue of seed rain is far more relevant in Scotland than it is across the UK. So future legislation on this topic must address this head on. Presiding Officer, it's my hope that the next Parliament will address some of the issues I've outlined today, as they are not going to go away. And the longer we wait to take decisive and ambitious action, the more costly and complex the necessary action will be. But action we must take. So we on these benches will be voting for the bill tonight and look forward to seeing it become an act. Thank you.
Thank you. And we move to winding up speeches. I call on Mark Ruskell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I take this opportunity to thank the clerks of the committee, my fellow committee members, Spice, and the witnesses who all gave evidence. And, can I in particular thank members of Scottish Environment Link and RSPB Scotland, who I think bring considerable expertise and wisdom, both as conservationist land managers, but also as policy specialists as well. I think this bill has been a single opportunity to make progress in this Parliament to tackle the nature emergency. But we do need another bill in the next session. I mean, it's clear in areas like clean water that we are falling out of alignment with the European Union. We are way behind on that. It's clear that in terms of the way that we reform the management of our seas and coastal waters and fisheries, that we are slipping behind. We're slipping behind the rest of Europe. We're slipping behind, sadly, England as well. And I think what we've seen coming through this bill has been a frustration from coastal communities, being reflected in many of the amendments that have been brought forward at Stage 2 and Stage 3. And I point to amendments from Ariane Burgess, Sarah Boyack, trying to fill a huge gap in this bill, and there just wasn't the time to really unpack that. And I think Finlay Carson makes a good point here. He perhaps didn't make a good point about greyhounds earlier on, but I think he has made a good point here about the gap in terms of marine management that will have to be filled in the next session if we are to have a hope of moving forward. On deer management, I'm not entirely sure what the Minister's National Venison Food Supply Chain Cold Management Plan is actually going to look like at this point. And I think there are still questions in my mind about who will be setting the ambition here. Will it be Nature Scott or will it be Sainsbury's? I'm watching to see whether this plan will actually align with the recommendation of the Independent Deer Working Group going forward. On national parks, as I said earlier, I think the government needs to be in a position to feel confident in leading a debate on national parks, to feel confident in celebrating national parks, to expand them, to designate new parks. And I think perhaps a good basis of that in the next session of Parliament will be for this Parliament to review what has happened with national parks and the benefits that have been delivered over 20 years since their establishment, and to explore some of the misinformation that we see in the public narrative around national parks. I think we should value them. I think we should be empowering them to protect our environment more and to support the communities that live in them. And I think we talked about lessons earlier on. I mean, there are certainly lessons from the Flamingo Land debacle, which I don't think have been fully incorporated into this bill. But those lessons will need to be learned. Just briefly, I think we've seen progress on many individual issues in this bill, and I appreciate that's a challenge because many of these issues were not part of the original bill, and it's a challenge for committees to scrutinise. But, you know, on Swift bricks, I think it showed how Holyrood can be really fleet of foot. You know, it's taken 4 years at Westminster to try and get action on this, and they've still not achieved it. We have managed to do it through a consensual conversation in a matter of weeks. It shows how devolution can work well to make progress in these islands. And again, I'm pleased with colleagues Ariane Burgess getting through the amendment to incorporate Ramsar into this bill. I mean, that will certainly be welcomed by her constituents at Cool Links. And I'm also really pleased that Minister Fairley managed to finally close the loophole in grouse moor licensing. It's important that the licensed area moves beyond the narrow area where shooting takes place to where raptor species also nest and are persecuted. That's a campaign that I've been working on and highlighting since the Land Reform Bill. It's great that the Minister has found a robust solution to that in this bill. And many, many more issues have been dealt with, and many more issues have been raised, which hopefully will be dealt with in the future. So, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the Greens absolutely support the Natural Environment Bill at Stage 3. It's an important foundation for further action to tackle the nature emergency, but there is so much more that needs to come.
Thank you. And I call on Rhoda Grant.
Presiding Officer, and can I thank all those who assisted with the scrutiny of the bill, Parliament staff who support the committee. A very special thank you to the legislation team who helped members frame amendments to the bill, and I was reminded of the work they do when I was receiving emails from them late yesterday evening while we were debating amendments to this bill. Thank you too to all the stakeholders who engaged. The bill is wide-ranging and therefore there was many stakeholders involved, and it was really hard to keep on top of the correspondence as we neared Stage 3. So can I apologise to all of those who I haven't responded to? Their input was very much appreciated. And I guess not just appreciated, but it was essential because MSPs aren't specialists in all these issues. We build up our knowledge over time, but we depend on specialists allowing us to use their knowledge and experience to do our job well. As Sarah Boyack said, we face the twin challenges of climate change and nature emergencies, and we need legislation to help us meet those challenges. She was also clear that this was not a quick fix, but needs to be built upon for the well-being of not only our generation, but future generations. And one of the real challenges for the Rural and Islands Committee in scrutinising the bill was that we had a steep learning curve with regards to parts 1 and 2. And I remember chatting in the committee after the bill team briefing before we started our scrutiny and surmising that parts 1 and 2 appeared to be very straightforward, but the other parts, which we were much more familiar with, would require amending. And that was before we took evidence on how wrong we were. I guess the lesson to be learned from this for the next Parliament is to put legislation to the appropriate committee and not be swayed from doing that. I also want to thank the Minister and the Bill team for their constructive assistance with amendments regarding deer control. As Sarah Boyack said, we have sought to work constructively with stakeholders and with government to improve the bill. Mercedes Villalba laid bare the challenges we face. She spoke about her own work on non-native species, very clearly underlining that this bill is not job done, but a framework to redouble our efforts, and those sentiments were echoed by Mark Ruskell. Beatrice Wishart spoke about her amendments to dovetail this legislation with other targets and legislation. And that's incredibly important, that all legislation and strategies to protect our environment, nature and the planet work together simultaneously. Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour have been constructive. We've worked hard to improve the legislation wherever possible, to try to give voice to the concerns of stakeholders as they brought those to us, and using their knowledge and expertise to frame amendments to the bill. And we believe that that inclusive approach leads to better legislation. It garners wider support for the bill and the aims that it seeks to pursue. And I am pleased that we will be supporting this legislation when it's voted on tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Jamie Halcrow-Johnston.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I just remind the Chamber of my register of interest of partnering farming business, a member of the NFU and SLE and the Royal Highland Agricultural Society. And can I start on a positive note? Despite differences over the content of the bill, the aspirations to protect and enhance Scotland's natural environment is one that is shared, I'm sure, around this chamber. And Scotland has, by some metrics, suffered some significant nature depletion, and this is a legacy that we're slowly coming to terms with. Members have spoken at various stages of the bill about the impact of changes to the environment and their own personal experiences within their own lifetimes. Because as much as we can point to the 15% decline in average species abundance since the mid-1990s, it's that direct experience that often gives this issue its urgency. It's welcome that we have reached a time where there is a broad acceptance of the human role as the role of the human role as a custodian of our environment, and an appreciation of what we can do to reverse some of the losses. The need for nature restoration and positive stewardship is, however, something that many farmers, crofters and land managers have recognised for many years, long before a government strategy was put in place. And it's often been private initiatives that have led the way in improving biodiversity. And where flexibility is available and innovation allowed, outcomes are often better. Despite the shared aspirations, this is also a bill where we have ended up with almost 200 amendments at Stage 3 and plenty of points of contention. Stage 2 was, as has been said, far from straightforward, and I commend the work of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. Part 1 of the bill has been improved considerably at Stage 2 by a spirit of holding the Scottish Government to account on targets and a recognition that ministers have, to be charitable, struggled with such targets in the past. We now have a range of provisions in the bill providing in more detail for the setting of targets, but just as importantly for reporting and reviewing progress against them. At Stage 1, I pointed out that action to promote biodiversity and meet the targets that will be required by the bill must be a twin test of effectiveness and sustainability. These amendments move us closer to a position that can be achieved. Part 2 of the bill has been removed, while Part 3 has received a number of purposeful amendments, including by my colleague Tim Eagle, to require national parks policy statements on a 10-year basis, clarifying the purpose and approach to the park authorities. Part 4 could fill a lengthy speech in itself, and I recognise the extensive work that my colleague Edward Mountain has done here with the deer management elements of the bill in the hope of improving the Scottish Government's approach. I've pushed my own proposals around goose management. My native Orkney, for example, has no deer, but has suffered considerable ecological damage from visiting geese populations. And we must recognise the shared principles here of population management, and while taking species-specific approaches, acknowledge that similar challenges can be present across species and in different parts of the country, which is a short way of saying that a one-size-fits-all approach to Scotland's natural environment will not work, nor will an approach that simply prioritises rewilding at the expense of our rural economy. Rural Scotland is a daily workplace for hundreds of thousands of people. It provides the food we eat, as well as being home to thousands of businesses that support our communities. And it's nothing new to say that a balance must be struck between competing interests in the countryside. Where this bill does address detail and often leaves these questions to the future, it too often seems to get that balance wrong. My amendment on ecological focus areas and their application in the islands, for example, sought to recognise the distinct position and challenges of farming on Scotland's island communities. That balance is different there from farms in the central belt, and the margins are lower and greening more difficult to achieve. And as an islander, I know all too well the problems that ill-considered legislation can have in places where Edinburgh is so distant. This legislative process has been a chance for the Scottish Government to recognise Scotland's diversity, to acknowledge that there is not one natural environment but many, but too often it has failed to do so. Presiding Officer, this bill has been one best framed in terms of missed opportunities from the bill's introduction to today's proceedings. There has been as much commentary on what the bill has done as what it will do. Has not done as to what it will do. That has been disappointing, and once again rural Scotland is left looking for more answers than the Scottish Government is willing to provide. It was a bill that was a long time in the making and subject to extensive pre-legislative consultation. We might have expected a package of measures that seemed a little more complete. But this is the bill we have, and it is better for having gone through the parliamentary process. But I think few will be satisfied with the outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on the Minister to wind up.
Presiding Officer, thank you very much. And I want to just take a moment to, first of all, to thank from the bottom of our hearts, on behalf of Gillian Martin and Mary Goujon, our bill teams, our legislation teams, our policy development teams and our officials, our private office and the parliamentary staff. They have put in a hell of a work to be able to get this bill to where we are today, and I think we owe them an enormous debt of gratitude. And I want to thank them very much from all of us. I also want to say that this is Mary Goujon's last bill, and I think that she'll be an enormous loss to the Parliament next year. She has been an amazing person to work with, and I think rural Scotland has been better by the work that she's put in. Presiding Officer, this National Environment Bill, at its heart, is about respect. It's about respect for nature, it's about respect for our land, and it's about respect for the people who steward it and who care for it. This is a bill with both people and nature at its heart, and that is something I care deeply about. And it's a bill that delivers for nature and people with both ambition and balance at its core. That's why, for the first time, we are putting in place statutory nature restoration targets, targets which will drive positive, on-the-ground actions and that keep us on the trajectory to restore and regenerate nature by 2045. And if future governments are found to be wanting in that ambition for nature, this bill contains the mechanisms to make sure that this Parliament can hold them to account. But it does much more than that. It strengthens the legislation underpinning our two fantastic national parks, and it provides us with additional tools to manage our deer in a way that will both be positive for the environment and create entrepreneurial opportunities as we develop our world-class venison product, delivering new jobs and healthy food for the Scottish nation. And through the amendments that members have championed, this bill will, if passed, will deliver in a range of areas. It will give Scottish ministers new powers to develop legislation relating to wildfire management, forestry management and new rights to enable crofters and tenants to control deer, to name but a few of the progressive amendments that have been added to the bill today. Presiding Officer, the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss represent the existential threat of our times. Scotland's natural environment underpins our economy. It underpins our agriculture, our well-being and our quality of life and the pride that we all feel in this land. And we all know that not to do anything now is absolutely not something that we can do. It is not an option for any responsible government. So if we want the Scotland of tomorrow to be one where we have healthy communities, sustainable quality food production and food security with vibrant rural industries, then we need to ensure that our ecosystems thrive. This bill isn't about environment over economy. It's about both. It's two sides of the same coin, whereas we cannot have one without the other. So this bill matters, not because of what it symbolises, but because of what it will enable us to deliver. The bill creates a practical delivery chain, ambitious targets, and that will drive real action on the ground. And that action will be delivered not just by government, but by the people who know the land best. This government is determined to ensure our key stakeholders have the tools and the support that they need to protect and restore nature in a way that works for rural land managers and communities, and one which builds on their stewardship and recognises and respects their role as the custodians, as we all are, of our iconic land and the species that coexist with us. So we will continue to work in partnership with our farmers, our crofters, our keepers, our stockers, our land managers, our ENGOs and the community organisations that ensure that the measures we put in place are proportionate, are workable, are successful and that they deliver benefits not just for nature but for the people of Scotland. Of course, one bill can't do everything, although we've certainly packed plenty into this one. Members and stakeholders have raised important points and demanded more action in areas such as marine protection, non-native species, guidance, monitoring and delivery frameworks. And we're making headway in those areas, but some issues, particularly those requiring specific technical detail, are better delivered through secondary legislation, strategies or implementation programmes. It is crucial if we are able to focus resources on delivery, rather than introducing greater complexity and duplication of effort. So as we draw this debate to a close, it is worth reflecting on the shared effort that has brought us here today. The bill is Parliament at its best. It has been shaped by members across the chamber. We have improved through engagement, and we're building consensus, including the debate that has been held here today. I hope that the unity of purpose shown by members to tackle the biodiversity crisis and to push the government to go faster and further to deliver the nature-positive outcomes that we all want to see will now be reflected in member support in this bill. But, Presiding Officer, I have to say I am disappointed in the Tories, because we have made significant efforts to find solutions to the many issues that were raised. We brought them in, we asked for their input to find and to contribute to making this bill the success that it is. I can only imagine that it's politics that is getting in the way of passing good legislation, so I welcome the great cooperation from the Labour Party, from the Liberal Democrats and from all the other... No, the debate is finished, Mr Halcroft-Johnson. We've had these discussions, and I really am disappointed that we are not allowed, that you will not vote for a bill that has been so much work put into by everybody. So, Presiding Officer, I welcome the rest of the support that we're getting from the other parties in this chamber. I'm disappointed in the Tories, but I commend the Natural Environment Bill Scotland to Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. I call Martin Whitfield for a point of order.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer. In your guidance on conduct in the Chamber, underpinned by our standing orders, it states that members, including ministers, have a personal responsibility to be accurate and truthful in their contributions during parliamentary proceedings. Presiding Officer, I'm concerned that the First Minister may have erred in his quote attributed to the Council at the Scottish Hospitals inquiry at FMQs today. The First Minister stated as a quote, "There is no evidence of external pressure on NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to open the hospital early or before it was ready to be opened." There appears to be no such statement made by the Council to the inquiry, and can I seek your guidance on how a member could rectify such an error if it has occurred and set the record straight?
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. As the member will be aware, as members are aware, the accuracy of a member's contribution is not a matter for the Chair to rule on, but as a matter of courtesy and respect. I would expect all members always to strive to be accurate in their contributions, and members are also aware of the mechanisms that are available to them if they wish to correct the record. We will move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 20611 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme, and I call on the Minister to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, and I call on Ash Regan to speak to and move Amendment 20611.1.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the motion. I'm asking this Parliament for something that should not be controversial. Time. Time to do our jobs properly by respecting the gravity of our task and acknowledging the reality of those whose lives are central to this debate. And having been involved in this members' business process now after progressing many government bills, I'm feeling very much the lack of parity of esteem that is given to members' bills. This is something I believe that the Parliament should reflect on for the next session. And yesterday's scheduling by the Bureau of 80 minutes for such an important debate shows the complete disconnect between this Parliament and public interest and survivor reality. This is not an abstract policy discussion like the one on greyhound tracks that are no longer operational. There are women and children being exploited less than a mile from here and all across Scotland, and it is a growing problem. This is about violence, it's about inequality, it's about coercion and it's about trauma, and it is about our children and our women. And this Parliament last legislated substantively on prostitution in 2007, and that was nearly 20 years ago. And over 2 decades, survivors have organised, they've spoken out, and they've repeatedly asked to be heard. And next week, their long wait is over. They've shared painful experiences at committee, at parliamentary events and in the media, often at great personal cost to themselves, in the hope that the lawmakers in this place will finally listen to them. And after almost 20 years, I would think that surely the very least we can offer them is a full debate and proper scrutiny by their elected representatives. And let's be honest, this isn't a new conversation that we're having. This approach has been SNP policy for many years, and members know this. It's also established Scottish Government and COSLA equally safe policy for more than 10 years. And the direction of travel has been clear. And the CPG on commercial sexual exploitation was also clear in its inquiry on the subject that we must move on from talking now to acting. My unbuyable bill is not sudden. It's not unexpected. It's not rushed. We have a 5-year term, and we cannot tell survivors again, not yet, but soon. This is a failure for them and of this Parliament to act for them. Public engagement on this now is intense. I have members across the chamber approaching me over the last couple of days to say that they didn't think they were going to be able to speak in the debate and they desperately wanted to take part. This is deeply troubling, and it's not equitable either. We've had over 2-hour debates for many bills over the years. Recently, obviously, we had the assisted dying stage 1, which we debated, I believe rightly, for over 4 hours. Members' bills deserve this parity of esteem. They deserve timing that is dependent on the breadth and the depth of the debate. And in my opinion, sensitivity of this issue deserves more time, not less. It demands space for evidence to be tested, for voices to be weighed carefully, and for members to fulfil their responsibility to deliberate thoughtfully. So I urge this Parliament to grant us the necessary time for a thoughtful debate, to allow us to give this the right amount of time before reaching their decision. I am grateful to the Bureau yesterday for listening and extending the time slightly, but I would urge members to support my amendment now and give this debate the time that it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to put on record that I support Ash Regan's amendment to move decision time to 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, the 3rd of February. The Prostitution Offences and Support Scotland Bill has generated a lot of interest among MSPs, and many, myself included, wanting to speak in the Stage 1 debate. Presiding Officer, I cannot emphasise enough how important this subject is, especially to women and girls. I clearly know that in the past, multiple members have been allowed to speak in certain topics. Under the business motion, my party would get fewer speakers than when the debate was due to run for 80 minutes. That doesn't seem right, and Ms Regan's amendment would resolve this issue. It is also my understanding that Megan Gallagher and Ash Regan are happy to swap the order of their Stage 1 debates. Our business manager has put a request for this, but it is my understanding that the Bureau has yet to agree to it. Therefore, I hope MSPs vote for Ash Regan's amendment today.
Thank you. And I call on the Minister to respond on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau.
Presiding Officer, the Bureau puts a great deal of thought into the scheduling of business, and the challenges around accommodating all of the wide variety of business that has to be fitted in to the closing weeks of this Parliament are acute, as demonstrated by the fact we have 4 Stage 1 proceedings taking place next week, not to mention opposition business. In making this work, we seek to treat all aspects of business appropriately and fairly, and wherever possible, accommodate the reasonable asks of our committees. We have in 2 instances in recent weeks acceded to requests from the Justice Committee in relation to the Prostitution Offences and Support Scotland Bill. The first involved extending the Stage 1 deadline by a fortnight in order to help members agree their report. The second came yesterday, when the committee convener asked for additional time next Tuesday to discuss their Stage 1 debate in the Chamber. For the benefit of the Chamber, I should say business managers agreed unanimously to extend the time allowed for that debate, which has now been extended by 40 minutes to 2 hours, as covered by the business motion before us. And I'm therefore surprised to hear the contribution of Pam Gozal, because, as I reiterate, that was a unanimous decision by the Bureau. By any reasonable judgment, I think the Bureau have been extremely accommodating in recognising the interests of members in this bill and the varying opinions on its merits. It seems, however, Presiding Officer, that reasonableness cuts just one way, at least when it comes to the member in charge of the bill, I'm afraid. They too were seeking an extension to the time for debating their bill, and as I noted, the Bureau granted this. However, tonight, Ash Regan, in Challenging Business, not only wants even more time set aside, she seeks to direct how the business of this Parliament should be ordered on Tuesday. Presiding Officer, I know that decisions taken by business managers can frustrate colleagues at times, but I would hope that it's acknowledged that when it comes to scheduling business, we do so fairly and equitably. I therefore ask members to support the business motion, which provides the prostitution offences and Support Scotland Bill Stage 1 with a more than fair hearing, and reject the amendment. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 20611.1 in the name of Ash Regan, which seeks to amend Motion 20611 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.